1 million times just because of the war situation right there. So yeah, and usually I'm just gonna say, all right, around 500, Ukraine around 500-ish times, and as of right now, I'm just gonna do like 100 per video. So let's get doing it. 3, 2, 1. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Okay, 200 times. I'm just gonna do 200 times per video. So this video 200, next video 200 to 400, and I'm gonna do that until I get to 1 million. And this is all because of the war zone in Ukraine. So yeah.